Gemini said, "We often gaze at ancient ruins through a lens of quiet reverence, imagining a world of stone and silence. We see the majestic arches of the past and assume they were built for beauty or grand religious devotion. But the dust of Judea in the year 30 tells a far more violent story about the bricks beneath your feet. If you stood at the gates of Jerusalem 5 minutes after sunset, you weren't just a late traveler. You were a target for the shadows. No lanterns flickered to guide you, and no law existed to protect those left outside the locked limestone walls. Behind those heavy timber doors, families huddled in a suffocating darkness that felt like a living entity. Today, we peel back the layers of myth to reveal the raw, perilous mechanics of survival in the world Jesus actually inhabited. In descending into the dirt-packed alleyways of first-century Jerusalem, the first thing that hits you isn't the history, but the physical struggle for air and movement. We often imagine these as open, spiritual spaces, but the reality was a suffocating maze where streets rarely exceeded 2 meters in width. What residents called a road was actually a chaotic trench where heavily laden donkeys competed for every centimeter of space against wastewater flowing down the center. This tightness wasn't just poor planning, it was a deliberate choice for safety. Every house was built as a miniature fortress with thick walls and 0 windows facing the street, literally turning their backs on a world perceived as a zone of danger and theft. But this security came at a high cognitive price. In a village like Capernaum, silence was an unaffordable luxury. Since homes were pressed against each other to save stone, thin walls meant hearing every argument, every crying baby, and every grain of wheat being ground in the house next door. This constant auditory surveillance meant that true privacy simply didn't exist. In the local Aramaic dialect, they didn't even have a word for privacy as we know it today. Instead, they used the term sēther, which implied a suspicious hiding or chilling. To want to be alone was to be guilty. Your life was an open book to your neighbors, and this lack of walls wasn't just a nuisance. It was the very mechanism the tribe used to ensure you were staying loyal to the clan's rules. But if the social pressure inside the home was heavy, the real tribunal waited at the village fountain. For a family to survive in the parched hills of Judea, women had to perform the day's most grueling labor, carrying clay jars that weighed over 20 kilograms when full. We see the image of the Samaritan woman at the well and think of a peaceful meeting. In reality, carrying that jar was like balancing a heavy microwave on your shoulder under a 40 degrees Celsius sun. The Giyang Nuoc wasn't just a utility. It was the ancient version of a social network where reputations were built or destroyed in minutes. If you were a respectable woman, you went in groups during the cool morning hours. If you arrived at the well at the 6th hour, exactly at noon, like the woman in the biblical account, it was a loud signal of social exclusion. Facing the unbearable heat was a desperate attempt to avoid the judgmental stares of neighbors. In this world, obtaining a glass of water was a political act where your timing told everyone exactly where you stood in the community's hierarchy. Stepping across the threshold of a common home in Galilee meant experiencing an immediate thermal and sensory shock. As your eyes fought to adjust to the sudden darkness, your nose provided the first map of the interior. The air was thick and humid, saturated with the pungent scent of dry straw and fresh manure. While we might expect a family living room, what actually existed was a sophisticated biological heating system designed for one purpose: survival against the freezing desert nights. To stay warm without electricity or modern heaters, the architecture prioritized the most efficient heat source available: livestock. The lower entrance floor was packed earth, where goats, sheep, and often a 50-kilogram donkey were brought inside to sleep. Hearing the heavy breathing of a large animal beside you wasn't a sign of poverty. It was a standard survival tactic. Their rising body heat warmed the elevated stone platform where the human family slept, ate, and lived just a few centimeters above. It is precisely along the edge of this platform, where the human zone met the animal zone, that you would find stone cavities or wooden boxes carved for feed. The ancient term for this feeding trough was a manger. This physical reality completely flips our understanding of the famous scene in Bethlehem. When historical accounts mention there was no room at the inn, it likely meant the main guest area was overcrowded, forcing the family to stay in the lower section of a relative's house, sharing the floor with the household animals. This crowded existence was governed by a strict rule of transparency. In these stone boxes, every sound was shared, creating a psychological environment where keeping a secret was nearly impossible. This brings us to the ancient concept of sēther. While we value a private life, the residents of Nazareth viewed any attempt at isolation as a direct threat to the group. If you weren't heard, you weren't trusted. During the blistering summer months, this survival machine had to be inverted. When the indoor heat became a stone oven, life migrated to the flat roof made of compacted mud and branches. And this was the only place to escape the ammonia fumes from the animals below and catch a breeze. Every square centimeter of space was a contested resource, a reality that forced every resident to understand their exact place in a rigid hierarchy that didn't just govern where you slept, but how you were perceived by the world outside. While the dusty villages of the Galilee operated on ancient traditions, a giant shadow loomed just 6 kilometers away, a visual shock that most modern readings completely overlook. Nazareth wasn't a remote desert island. It was a mere 1-hour walk from the city of Sepphoris, a dazzling Roman metropolis. Imagine a young carpenter waking up in a stone house, smelling of goats, only to walk a few miles and find himself facing massive marble columns, intricate mosaic floors, and a theater capable of seating 5,000 people. Herod Antipas was rebuilding this city as his capital, creating a cultural collision that was a daily reality for local workers. Many scholars believe that Joseph and his son likely found work on these massive construction projects. This means they didn't just hear about Roman power, and they literally handled the stones used to build it. This proximity changes how we listen to the teachings of that era. When the term hypocrites was used, it wasn't an abstract religious word. It was a direct reference to the Greek actors wearing masks in the Sepphoris theater just over the hill. But the tension between these two worlds wasn't just about architecture, it was about a heavy hand reaching into your pocket every single day. Tax collection in the 1st century was a physical confrontation. If you were a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, you had to pass through a customs post where a publican, a local official, like the man named Matthew, would rummage through your baskets. He had the authority to decide on the spot how much of your catch would be confiscated to fund the emperor's luxury across the Mediterranean. But beyond the money, a specific Roman law fueled a visceral hatred in the streets, the law of the mile. At any moment, a Roman soldier could stop a Jewish citizen, drop his 60-pound pack at their feet, and command them to carry it. By law, that civilian was forced to march for 1 mile, roughly 1.5 kilometers. It was a supreme humiliation, turning a father into a pack animal in front of his children. This is why the suggestion to go the 2nd mile was so explosive. In a world of forced submission, it was a way to reclaim dignity through an act of defiant generosity. All that confiscated sweat and silver eventually flowed away from the poor villages toward places like Caesarea Maritima, a port city of white marble and hippodromes. For a peasant, this opulence was the physical proof of their own hunger, turning the entire region into a powder keg ready to ignite. As the sun dipped below the horizon in the year 70, the people of Jerusalem faced a terror that reached far beyond the Roman blockade. For us, nighttime is a mere scenery change, but for a Judean peasant, darkness was an absolute wall. Public lighting was non-existent. Inside a home, or keeping a small clay lamp burning, meant literally burning the family's food, as olive oil was both fuel and nourishment. This darkness wasn't just a logistical hazard, it was a spiritual battlefield. In the local worldview, the night belonged to the Shedim malevolent spirits, believed to haunt ruins and desert winds. Stepping outside after the city gates were locked at nightfall was considered a form of spiritual suicide. This is why the metaphor of being the light of the world carried the weight of a physical shield. It was the only thing standing between a family and the perceived chaos of the unseen. But while the people feared the shadows that ended at dawn, a definitive storm of iron was gathering on the political horizon. The tension that had simmered for decades under the heavy hand of tax collectors and the humiliation of Roman boots finally erupted into a total revolt. The empire's response was not just a suppression, but an annihilation. General Titus led the Roman legions to encircle Jerusalem, cutting off the vital supply caravans. Historical accounts from the siege describe a hunger so desperate that it led to the total collapse of the ritual purity the society held so dear. When the walls finally fell, the fire was so intense that the gold decorating the great temple melted, dripping into the cracks of the stones. Roman soldiers were forced to dismantle the sanctuary block by block to retrieve the metal